One of the major contributors to the project from day one has been somebody I've known for over 15 years now, is David Waters. And David was a contributor to the public service for over 30 years. He's worked in a variety of economic portfolios, including he was ADM at Industry, Treasury Board, he was ADM at Finance and Knowledge Economy. He was even the Commissioner of the Coast Guard at one point. A lawyer by training, he's now the head of the Global Advantage Consulting Group, and today he's here to speak about the innovation ecosystem in Canada. Please join me in welcoming David Waters to the stage. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Tim, for that introduction. What I want to talk about today is just get this going here. Great. Whoop. I'm going to go back just one. I'm going to talk about the innovation ecosystem, but from a particular point of view, and that point of view is how it can be used to actually grow the middle class and create middle class jobs. So that's the structure that I'm going to be covering with you. And the first kind of thing I want to say is just basically I'll look at four kind of components here. I think we have to have a pretty good understanding of what innovation is. Most of you do, but just to really reflect on that a little bit. Next, really looking at the whole issue of why is innovation important for economic growth. Then we'll look at, well, how innovative is Canada actually today? And then we'll look at, well, what can we do to try and improve the innovation system across the country? I think for most of you, if you've been out walking in downtown Ottawa, you've probably seen many, many, many of these signs. Ottawa really is so difficult to get around with the light rail transport system underway. So this is the international sign for Men at Work, but it's also an interesting kind of summary in terms of what is an innovation system. And basically a simple definition is doing the right things better. What's interesting is when you then look at the components actually inside this particular triangle, you see a person, you see a shovel, which is technology, and you see work being done, the pile of dirt. With respect to people then, one of the issues is, well, what are the quality of the skill sets that are going to be needed for a future innovative society in Canada? How many graduates are we getting out of universities? Do they have the right skill sets? A lot has been said about work-integrated learning now. Do they have the STEM skills, the coding kind of skills that they're going to need to be productive? With respect to the second component, technology, one of the issues here is, well, what are the nature of emerging technologies that we really need to understand? Huge amounts of big data, how do we incorporate that in business and government? And what about new emerging technologies in the life science, genomics area, but also clean tech, energy technologies, and so on. So that's the second component that is needed in terms of this mix of creating innovation. The third is work. So what is the nature of the work to be done? In this particular case, you see a person who's shoveling, maybe creating a hole in terms of the light rail transport, but it could also be building social housing. So there's an element of an ethical dimension here, and that's why the summary is doing the right things better. What are the right things? What is the right kind of work that we want done? And how can we do that in an innovative way? So again, I want to bring in this concept of the inclusiveness of the approach to innovation, which we may want. I think one of the elements is innovation is such a new buzzword, but is innovation itself really new? This is a picture that I took 2 years ago with my family in Ankara, Turkey. I'd lived there for 2 years, and it shows one of the first innovations from 10,000 years ago, and it's a digging tool or an axe. But if you can imagine someone sitting around a campfire and taking a piece of wood, one component, taking a rock, a second component, and then taking animal skin, and actually combining that to make a tool. And that's the essence of innovation. So it's combining things that are different and making them productive. I'm now going to show you the first communication device, mobile device that was developed, and this is from the same museum. When you look at that tablet in the center, what it is, it has cuneiform script on both the front side and the back side. And it really is exactly the same size as a handheld iPhone or tablet. What's interesting in terms of innovation is this actually has 2 screens, so it's better than an iPhone. It has writing in the front and back. You'll also notice that it's wireless, so it is actually extremely modern. And in terms of the app that is reflected there, it actually is a trade treaty between two Sumerian tribes in the Anatolian area. So innovation is not something new. Innovation arguably is just the history of the evolution of human society. Turning to the way in which this would be looked at by the Department of Finance, and this builds on components in several budgets about the structure of looking at innovation activity. At the very top, you've got quality of life. That's what we're trying to improve. And I think in particular, this government is quite noticeable and is really reinforcing the idea of an inclusive quality of life. The benefits of innovation must accrue to everybody in society. The general way in which you do that, though, is to focus on standard of living and economic growth. And we've had Dominic Barton coming out with a number of recommendations about how to increase the growth of the Canadian economy from the 1.2%. That is essentially achieved, though, by looking at how competitive your industries are, in particular in global markets, and that depends on their productivity. Productivity, as you know, is a challenge for Canada, where there's a gap between our productivity and that of the U.S. of somewhere between 20–25%. And there are three components of productivity as shown on this illustration. The first is looking at labor, and you can look at the quality and the quantity of labor. And one of the issues that has just been announced is trying to look at immigration into Canada as one way of trying to increase the supply of qualified labor in the country. On the right-hand side, then, you've got capital, and you're looking at the quality and the quantity of capital. And as you know, we tend not to adopt ICT as rapidly as many other countries do, so we have a bit of a challenge there. But the third element, which Peter Nicholson is famous for talking about, is multi-factor productivity. And it really is an issue of innovation. It's how do you combine labor and capital together in different ways to actually produce increased benefits. Below that, then, you have what is interesting, which is the 4 ways in which you can innovate. These are from the OECD definition. I think many of you are probably quite familiar with them. What's interesting, though, is on the left-hand side, you have research and development. So the standard kind of breakdown in terms of goods R&D and service R&D. Unfortunately, one of the things we tend to forget about is that the Canadian economy is 75–78% services. And yet many of our programs really are still targeting goods R&D, and that's only about 10, 11, 12% of economic activity in Canada. The other element, though, is you have all of these other ways of innovating in an economy, and these are not well understood or well measured, and yet they're extremely important. So if you're looking at the whole issue of process innovation, it can be 3D printing, but it can be things just-in-time inventory controls and so on and so forth. Demanding a lot of innovative in terms of how we structure production. But you've also got marketing innovation. And marketing innovation can get into Shopify is a great example, the way in which Dell actually transformed how you might buy a computer. Many illustrations of that. And then you've got organizational innovation, which looks at things like Airbnb, looks at things like Uber, for example. The issue here is that so many of these kinds of innovation actually involve social innovation. And unfortunately, in our country, we really don't understand the nature of that all that well, and we don't record it. So many industries are highly innovative. They just don't do formal R&D, but they do other kinds of innovation, and we need to try and understand that better and measure it better. If I look then at the Canadian innovation systems, how is this all kind of pieced together? There are 5 components of any innovation system, and they're represented by these bubbles here. The first is the federal government. Then you have provincial governments, in our case, or state governments. You have the role of the higher education sector. You have then the private sector that will absorb the inputs from these other sectors, and their job is to get these goods and services into global marketplaces. If you look at the role then of the federal government, it really has a couple. One is it is reinforcing through infrastructure investments, Canada Chairs programs for researchers, that relationship with the higher education sector. It also, though, has functions directly in relation to the private sector, has a spending power, has a tax power as well, for example, SR&ED. It has regulatory programs, and it has procurement that is beginning to look at a little bit better. A lot of talk about SBIR kinds of programs to actually facilitate innovation. In a similar fashion, the provincial governments have roles, very significant roles in funding the base operations of universities, but then also funding some research, and they provide some support for the private sector. Universities themselves do an outstanding job in terms of creating talent, both the universities and the polytechniques and colleges, and getting that into the private sector as well as into governments. In terms of the IP, in my mind, that is much less important in terms of the function and role of these particular institutions. Private sector then takes all of these resources, combines them, and gets new products and services into global markets. And it's from those global markets then that you get the revenue stream that comes back to the private sector that permits them to actually create middle-class jobs, to train more workers, to actually conduct more research and development. And to make the whole system self-sustaining, you have the flow of income tax and personal taxes back to keep this system flowing on again, a sustainable basis. So that's the basic structure. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this. This is a map of the 2016 innovation system, but it's just to show you its complexity. And yet, you have these same functions. So the federal government, the provincial governments, the university sector, private sector, and getting into global markets, the flow of resources coming back, the fact that that flow is so important just because, you know, the size of the Canadian market is so small. You've really got to look at global exports, bringing back the resources to be able to create the middle-class jobs and to do the additional research and development. And of course, you then got going back into the tax system to make this all system sustainable. One of the challenges is you can actually look at this like Google Maps and go into different levels of granularity. So that red bubble on the first national map is the university system. This is a map of the university system itself that was done for the university presidents, input-output basis, and you can begin to see the risks and opportunities there, or you can take one university, as we did recently with the University of Toronto. And so you can go from a national to a sectoral down to a more detailed level in terms of understanding, again, the inputs and outputs going into an effective innovation system, in this case, one that is centered on a university and centered on the Toronto region. So that's the structure. If we look then at, well, how much research and development are we doing in Canada? And again, with the caveat that is one of the best proxies for looking at innovation, but it absolutely is not the whole story. In Canada, we spend about $31.6 billion on research and development. And you can see the funders of this at the top. On the left-hand side, you'll note that the federal government and the university sector are about the same. Then you've got three organizations that are much smaller at about a little bit less than $2 billion, and then the private sector at 14. We have a structure in which we funnel a lot of money into the universities as the centerpiece in terms of doing a lot of research. So when you're looking at the four bubbles in the bottom, there are really two that dominate, universities and the private sector. And the challenge there has been noted. How do we ensure we're getting the results of that research from the university sector into the private sector? One of the things to note, though, is other countries can do it differently. We're examining right now the German system, and they use independent organizations, the Fraunhofer Institutes, Leibniz, Max Planck, Helmholtz, to actually structure their approach to research a little bit differently with independent research organizations, but then linked into the university. Looking then at that $31.6 billion bubble and putting it on a global scale, here you have all of the world research and development that is conducted. It's about $2 trillion. Canada at $31.6 billion is only about 1.5% of that total. And that raises issues that we need to understand what's happening with global research and development to be able to incorporate that and make it available in all of our institutions, but in particular the private sector. I'm going to just show you very briefly how this system looks from the point of view. We tried to make data dance here, so we looked at this over a 5-year period from 2011. And keep your eye on the bottom corner where you've got China, as it begins to grow through 2012 and 2013. There really has been a remarkable explosion of research and development in a number of these countries. Canada is still that little globe just up roughly about in the center left. And as you get to 2016, you see the expansion in China, and you will also see there the fact that Korea is now the leading conductor of research and development in the world. Looking at the performance, how have we done over the past decade? This slide has been called the Decade of Darkness, and what it shows is Canada is compared to the average of the 34 OECD countries. They're on the top line. And whereas in 2004 we started off fairly close together, a little over 2% of our economic activity was devoted to research and development, over a 10-year period we really have gone in a direction that is the opposite of most OECD countries, and you can see that reflected in this particular slide. That gap is now about 33, 35%. But if we wanted to aspire to just catch up, if we wanted to just do as much R&D as other OECD countries, over the next 5 years, it would cost us an incremental $78 billion. I actually reran the numbers as a result of the fall update just 2 days ago, and the number's now about $74 billion, but roughly in the same ballpark. So when we see the investments that the government has made, and they have been very, very helpful, we need to keep in mind that much more would be required if Canada aspired just to become average in terms of its, R&D performance. This also then shows what other countries are doing, and so this is Germany in terms of the last 10-year period as well. But if we looked at Korea, they're up around about 4.2%. Israel is just under 4%. So relative to other countries that are advancing very, very quickly and are known for being innovative, Canadian performance really has been heading in the wrong direction. If I look at the question of industrial policy now, and so what does this all mean for the private sector in terms of being able to compete? One of the senses that I really have is that we really don't understand adequately the structure of the Canadian private sector. 75% of all firms in Canada, and this is the latest data from June 2016 from StatsCan and ISED, have less than about 4 people on average. And when you're looking at a 4-person firm trying to get into a global market, I mean, this really is remarkably challenging. And we should remember that 97% of all firms that actually do research and development are SMEs, and 97% that actually do get into export markets are SMEs as well. In addition, SMEs account for 90% of all employment in the private sector, and they account over the last decade for 90% of all growth in jobs as well. So if we're looking about creating middle-class jobs, I think we need to pay much more attention to the SME sector. The other thing to note is that other countries tend to look at collective approaches to research and to collective approaches to actually structuring their firms to get into global markets, and I would suggest that Canada should consider this as well. Here then is my summary in terms of how we're doing. I really think, Canada's out for a nice Sunday drive. You got mom and dad and, the kids and grandma and so on and so forth. But we're really not into that competitive domain, and when I look at our, what other countries are doing, one really could argue, they're like Formula One racing teams, and I think, it's the fact that they have these team efforts that we're really short of in Canada that we need to pay more attention to. So what do we do about this? How could we improve our performance? And these are some suggestions that I have that I think fit in with today's agenda. I think you need a target. In other words, what are you trying to accomplish? I think you need a method to achieve that target. And then I think you need to have a process in place that is going to permit you to do that. When I look at the question of a target, it really is, what are we trying to accomplish here? What are we really trying to build? And, I put these up for debate. I think we really should be looking at creating middle-class jobs as really the fundamental objective of this innovation system. And innovation just is a tool to achieve an objective. You actually do that by creating new products and services, and because the Canadian marketplace is so small, you have to get those products and services into global markets. So I think we need to set some target measures along those lines. In terms of the methodology to be able to do that, there are a whole range of these that one could look at, and just very quickly, you could do it by the kind of federal power, which is spending, tax, regulatory, procurement, which we're now getting into. These kinds of powers. On the tax side, there was a discussion just yesterday about tax credits and maybe, reshaping some of these. A lot of discussion that we need to take more money from the tax side and put it directly into assisting firms. You can do it by the institution targeted. We've targeted universities and polytechniques and colleges, accelerators and incubators, regional development organizations and so on. Arguably, we should be targeting firms a little more directly in terms of our approach. You can also do it by stage of company maturity. You can focus on startups. I mean, everybody now, though, is talking about scale-ups, market entry, market expansion. In my view, the closer you actually get to getting into a global marketplace, the fewer are the government programs that can assist you. You can also do it by sector, ICT sector, agri-food sector, clean tech, energy, fintech that we're going to be talking about later on today as well. All important sectors, but we need to make decisions about these. And you can then also do it on the basis of company need. Companies need access to talent, they need access to funding, they need access to mentorship and access to markets. You can also do it by region, so we've got $800 million for networks and clusters that are being talked about. Those can be on a regional basis, can focus on big cities, or you can focus on sectors that do tend to have a geographic concentration. Or you could focus it on results. Maybe we should be looking at creating 100,000 middle-class jobs by a particular target date. Maybe we should be looking at a cleaner export system in terms of GHG reductions in Canada. Or maybe we should be focused on youth unemployment, which is about 13%, and getting it down to 6%. So these are the different ways or methods you can use in terms of structuring your innovation system. And in terms of the issue of the approach you can take to achieve that target from a process point of view, to me there really is only one, and that is to create permanent partnerships, in effect, between the public sector, the private sector, and the academic sector that are real partnerships, where you're holding each other accountable over a longer term. You're deciding on the agenda that you can do in years 1, 2, 3, 4, so you have a plan that you're working towards. To this point, we've had innovation agendas in 2002, Alan Rock and I forget the lady from HRSDC that was actually involved with Alan in terms of, Jane Stewart was involved in that. We've had others in terms of Joe Rotman did one in about 2007. We've had OpenText and the sort of the latest one in 2011 and so on, but these have been ad hoc. We need to have a permanent structure, I think, in going forward. And finally, in terms of just summary, this is my last slide, and just to try and bring it all together, this is, I find, an interesting slide. If you look at it carefully, you'll see a roadway going down the middle of the picture. And if you imagine that as the boundary of Canada, on the right-hand side, you can see several people, Canadians. One's up on top of the Land Rover, the other's got his binoculars out, all looking intently and sincerely for innovative solutions. But look at what's behind them. If you look beyond the boundary of Canada, to me, this is both the risk and the opportunity of global competition. There is something that is ready to eat your lunch, that we need to understand the nature of that competitive environment in which we're operating. And my advice then is we need to turn around, look at what is happening globally from both the risk and the opportunity point of view. And to me, in doing that, we will look at creating more Canadian exports that will then permit us to create the middle-class jobs that I think this country needs. So thank you very much. I hope this has given a bit of a framework in terms of a very exciting agenda and very specific kind of issues in different sectors that we're going to be talking about shortly. So thank you.